England, 1485. The crown is not yet comfortable on Henry Tudor's head. The battlefield at Bosworth is still fresh in memory. The Wars of the Roses are not a distant story, but a living wound, and every nobleman who steps into the King's Hall carries a family history of loyalties, betrayals, confiscations, executions, and sudden reversals of fortune. Henry VII has won a kingdom, but winning a kingdom and keeping one are different things. He must look like a king before everyone fully accepts that he is one. He must dine like a king, travel like a king, reward like a king, pray like a king, and surround himself with the controlled magnificence of monarchy. In this world, dinner is never just dinner. The story is often told in a modern, irresistible form. The food at Henry VII's court was so bad that even his sons refused to eat it. It is a perfect sentence for a thumbnail. It is also much cleaner than the evidence allows. No surviving household account gives us a scene in which Prince Arthur, or the future Henry VIII, pushes away a plate and declares his father's kitchen unbearable. Royal children did not leave restaurant reviews, and Tudor clerks did not normally record a prince's disgust. What survives instead is something more interesting. Household ordinances, ceremonial descriptions, expenditure, menus from the wider Tudor court, medical ideas, records of fasting, evidence of enormous food production, and the physical remains of the places where royal households ate. From those fragments, a harsher reality appears. The royal table could be rich beyond imagination and still be repetitive, heavily controlled, overcooked, preserved, spiced, medically restricted, politically charged, and deeply unpleasant by modern standards. A prince could be surrounded by abundance and still have very little freedom over what reached his mouth. That contradiction is the key to Henry VII's court.
The first Tudor king ruled through caution, calculation, display, and fear of instability. His food system reflected the same instincts. The meal had to prove that the king possessed land, forests, fisheries, servants, wine, grain, livestock, imported spices, silver plate, and enough authority to make hundreds of people sit where they were told. A great household was a machine. Meat entered at one end, status came out at the other. Imagine approaching one of Henry's residences on a cold winter morning. The palace at Sheen, later rebuilt and renamed Richmond Palace after a devastating fire at the end of the 15th century, stands near the Thames. Boats move along the river. Carts arrive over muddy roads. Servants unload sacks, barrels, baskets, carcasses, bundles of firewood, flour, salt fish, poultry, onions, herbs, and casks of drink. Dogs bark. Horses stamp in courtyards. Smoke hangs low over tiled roofs. Somewhere inside, clerks are checking quantities. Somewhere else, men are carrying joints of meat toward roaring fires. In another room, pastry workers are shaping crusts, not merely as food, but as containers. In storerooms, salted provisions wait in darkness. In the hall, benches are being arranged according to rank. In the private apartments, the king may eventually eat far from most of the people who have made his meal possible. What looks from a distance like a feast is, from below stairs, industrial labour. Henry VII's kingship began in scarcity of another kind, scarcity of certainty. He defeated Richard III at Bosworth on August 22, 1485. His blood claim to the English throne was not strong by the neat standards that dynastic propagandists preferred to advertise. His victory had to be turned into legitimacy. He dated his reign from the day before Bosworth, a legal manoeuvre that made those who fought against him technically traitors. He was crowned in October. He married Elizabeth of York in January 1486, uniting the Lancastrian and Yorkist symbols in the image that would become the Tudor rose. Their first son, Arthur, had been born in September 1486, his name chosen with almost theatrical purpose. Arthur was not simply a baby, he was a message. The new dynasty wanted to suggest ancient British destiny, continuity, and providence. At court, food helped repeat that message every day.
A medieval and early Tudor king was expected to be generous. He had to feed a household, honour guests, maintain religious observances, reward service, and display magnificence without appearing ridiculous. Too little hospitality suggested weakness or meanness. Too much uncontrolled spending could drain the treasury and create dependency. Henry VII became famous, sometimes notoriously so, for financial discipline. Later writers exaggerated him into a miser counting coins in dark rooms, but the reality is subtler. He understood money as power. He also understood that royal display had to be strategic. A banquet could be expensive because it achieved something. A marriage feast, a diplomatic reception, a Christmas celebration, or a coronation dinner could announce stability more loudly than a proclamation. The people eating beneath the king were not all eating the same thing. Rank-shaped diet. Royal households operated through elaborate entitlements. Certain people had a right to particular quantities of bread, ale, wine, candles, fuel, or dishes. The principle later formalised in Tudor household regulations was already deeply rooted. Service at court came with food, and food expressed place in the hierarchy. A duke did not simply receive more calories than a groom, he received a different kind of recognition. Seating mattered, serving vessels mattered, the number of dishes mattered, the order in which they arrived mattered, who carved mattered, who tasted mattered, who stood while someone else sat mattered. To a modern viewer, the table might look overloaded. To a Tudor observer, it was readable. Bread alone could speak social language. Fine white bread made from carefully bolted wheat flour belonged toward the top of the hierarchy. Coarser loaves went elsewhere. Ale and beer were consumed widely, although the old myth that Tudor people never drank water is wrong. Clean water was used where available, and royal residences could have access to managed water supplies. Wine, especially imported wine, carried prestige. Sweet wine, spiced wine, and hippocras could appear in elite contexts. Salt was essential not only for flavour but for preservation, and the location of the salt cellar on a high table could acquire symbolic importance. To sit above the salt became associated with higher status, though the phrase itself belongs to later usage. The physical logic, however, was already present. Tables had geography. Then there was meat. Modern images of Tudor dining often show endless roasted animals, and the image is not entirely wrong. Elite households consumed extraordinary quantities of beef, mutton, pork, venison, poultry, and game. Fresh meat was a mark of privilege. Venison carried particular political meaning because deer came from controlled landscapes, parks, forests, and aristocratic networks. The gift of venison was not just protein, it was patronage you could eat. Hunting rights were expressions of power. When the king's household consumed deer, it consumed the landscape of monarchy. But the glamour disappears quickly if you move close to the fire. Roasting large joints required constant labour. Before modern ovens, controlled temperatures, refrigeration, and stainless steel preparation surfaces, cooking meat for a large household was exhausting and risky. Spits had to turn. Fires had to be fed. Fat spat into flame. Smoke filled working spaces. Floors became slick. Clothing absorbed grease. Meat could be boiled before roasting to shorten cooking time. Sauces could be strong with vinegar, wine, spices, or bread-thickened mixtures. A dish designed for a royal table might contain costly ingredients and still have a texture a modern diner would find heavy, soft, overworked, or strangely sweet. And sweetness did not wait politely for dessert. Late medieval and early Tudor elite cookery did not divide sweet and savoury as rigidly as many modern Western diets do. Sugar was expensive and therefore impressive. Dried fruit, dates, raisins, currants, honey, spices, and sweetened sauces could appear with meat. Almond milk was widely used, especially on fasting days. Spices such as pepper, cinnamon, cloves, mace, ginger, and saffron were not simply thrown onto rotten meat to disguise decay, another enduring myth. Imported spices were expensive and desirable precisely because they signalled wealth and connected the table to international trade. They were also part of medical thinking. Food was believed to possess qualities: hot, cold, moist, dry, that could affect the balance of humours in the body. That belief matters enormously if we want to understand what a royal child might or might not be allowed to eat. The Tudor body was not understood as a machine of calories, vitamins, microbes and cholesterol. It was understood through inherited classical medicine. Health depended on balance among the humours. Age, season, temperament, weather and illness could all influence what foods were considered safe. Young people were thought to have particular constitutions. Some foods were considered too cold, too moist, too coarse, too difficult to digest, or too stimulating. Physicians and caregivers might recommend foods not because they tasted pleasant, but because they were believed to suit the body. A prince with digestive trouble could be given a restricted diet in the middle of a palace, overflowing with game birds and sugar. Now picture Arthur Tudor as a boy.
He is not an ordinary child running freely through kitchens. From infancy, he is a political asset. His household is organised around his status as heir. His education is designed to prepare him for kingship. His health is a dynastic concern. His body belongs, in a sense, to the state. Every cough can carry political meaning. Every fever can frighten officials. Every meal is part nourishment, part supervision. He is expected to grow into a king who will secure the new dynasty his father fought to create. His younger brother Henry, born in 1491, grows under a different expectation. He is the spare, not the heir. Later imagination sees the future Henry VIII everywhere, huge and dominating. But the child Henry did not know that future. He grew in a world where Arthur stood first. The brothers did not necessarily spend their days sharing meals beside their father. Royal children maintained their own chambers and, increasingly as they grew, their own household structures. Their food passed through layers of servants, officials, cooks, nurses, tutors and attendants. The sentence, Henry VII served his sons, is therefore misleading if it makes us imagine a modern father personally ordering dinner for boys seated beside him. The king maintained the world in which they ate. He did not need to hand them the plate. This distance could make food more, not less, oppressive. A modern child can reject peas at a kitchen table and negotiate with a parent. A Tudor prince rejecting food risked involving servants whose careers depended on his welfare. If he became sick, someone might be blamed. If he lost weight, attendance could be questioned. If a dish was suspected of causing illness, physicians could intervene. If poisoning was feared, and royal courts were never entirely free of such fears, food could become a security problem. Poisoning anxiety was not fantasy in late medieval politics. Actual poisonings were rarer than rumour, but rumour itself shaped behaviour. A king who had survived rebellion and conspiracy had reason to think about access to his body. The royal table therefore became a controlled boundary. Food might be tasted. Servants handling dishes belonged to offices with defined responsibilities. Ceremonies of service made the route from kitchen to mouth visible. The idea was not simply to provide dinner, but to create trust through procedure. That procedure had a smell. Step deeper into the service corridors. You smell wood smoke, hot fat, damp wool, yeast, sour ale, fish, onions, sweat, wet straw, herbs, blood from butchery, wax and open drains. The palace is grand, but grandeur and sanitation occupy the same building. Waste has to go somewhere. Bones accumulate, ash accumulates, feathers accumulate, offal accumulates. Dishwashing requires water and labour. Greasy trenchers, pots, knives, spits, cauldrons, wooden boards, baskets and cloths move through human hands. Vermin are an ongoing threat in storerooms. Insects do not respect royal blood. Cold weather slows decay but makes work miserable. Warm weather makes preservation harder. There are no refrigerators humming behind the wall. Food preservation is therefore a constant negotiation with time. Salting, smoking, drying, pickling, potting, and keeping foods in cool spaces extend their life.
Fish may be salted or dried. Meat may be cured. Grain can be stored, but damp threatens it. Cheese changes with age. Butter can turn. Ale spoils. Wine oxidizes. Fruit is seasonal. Fresh produce must arrive quickly. The household depends on supply networks that stretch outward through estates, markets, merchants, rivers, roads, parks, fisheries, and contracted suppliers. The king's wealth reduces risk. It does not abolish biology. This is where the idea of bad food needs to be reconstructed. Bad compared with what? If you were a poor labourer, royal food could look miraculous. The court had access to fresh meat, fine bread, spices, imported wine, preserved fruits, almonds, sugar, game, fish, and professionally organised kitchens. Hunger was a real threat for many people outside palace walls, particularly when harvests failed or prices rose. For them, the problem was not that meat was overcooked. The problem was whether there would be meat at all. But if you are a modern diner imagining a palace restaurant, the shock runs in the opposite direction. Meat might spend hours in preparation. Fish could be strongly salted. Many vegetables were boiled. Texture mattered differently. Sauces could be thickened with bread. Dishes could combine flavours we now separate. There were no tomatoes from later English cuisine in the normal diet of Henry VII's early reign. No potatoes. No chocolate drinks at the royal table. No tea. No coffee. No refined modern desserts in the familiar sense. New World foods were only beginning to enter European awareness after Columbus's voyages. The English table of the 1480s and 1490s still belonged overwhelmingly to a medieval food world. And then came the church calendar. For a royal household, fasting and abstinence were not optional lifestyle experiments. Christian observance structured the year. On designated days, meat from warm-blooded animals could be prohibited, shifting demand toward fish and other permitted foods. Fridays mattered, Lent mattered, vigils and other fast days mattered. Elite households solved the problem not by eating little, but by eating differently. Fish could be luxurious. Pike, salmon, eel, lamprey, sturgeon, salt cod, herring, and other species depending on availability, region, season, and status. Almond milk could substitute for dairy in recipes. Elaborate fish dishes could demonstrate wealth just as meat dishes did. But imagine being a boy who dislikes fish. There is no simple escape.
The calendar does not care. To say that a prince refused his father's food may not be documented, but the conditions for refusal are easy to understand. Royal children had preferences, appetites, illnesses, and moods because they were human. The institution around them was not designed to prioritise preference. It was designed to prioritise health as contemporaries understood it: religious duty, rank, availability, and ceremony. A meal could be expensive and still be something a child dreaded. Henry VII himself inhabited an equally controlled world, though he possessed far more authority within it. The king's public eating could be ceremonial theatre. At major feasts, observers watched not only what he ate, but how he occupied space. A high table elevated him. Cloth, plate, attendance, music, heraldry, and ritual turned consumption into sovereignty. The monarch's body became an image of the realm, fed, protected, central, and separate. Yet Henry was not simply a symbol. He was a man who aged under the pressure of rule. He suffered losses that transformed his household. His wife, Elizabeth of York, died in 1503 after complications following childbirth. Their heir, Arthur, had died the previous year in April 1502, only months after marrying Catherine of Aragon. The dynasty that had seemed to be expanding suddenly narrowed. The spare, Henry, became the surviving male heir. Now the meaning of his meals changed. Before Arthur's death, young Henry could be important without being indispensable. After Arthur's death, every aspect of his health mattered more. He was the future of the dynasty. The king who had built his reign on security became even more protective of the son who remained. Later reports suggest the younger Henry's movements were increasingly controlled. Whether at table, in education, or in court access, his body was too valuable for ordinary freedom. A rich diet under such conditions could feel like a cage lined with silver.
The palace kitchen never stopped because grief entered the royal family. That is one of the cold truths of court life. Arthur could die at Ludlow, Elizabeth could die after childbirth, and still someone had to bake bread. Someone had to slaughter animals. Someone had to order fish. Someone had to carry ale. Someone had to wash dishes. Government and appetite continued through mourning. At Ludlow, where Arthur and Catherine established themselves after their marriage, the household represented royal authority in the Welsh marches. Arthur was not simply sent away as an unwanted child. He was being trained in regional governance, connected to the council in the marches of Wales, and given a political stage suitable for an heir. His household required its own logistics. Food had to follow him. A prince's table in Ludlow depended on local suppliers, estates, markets, hunting, preserved goods, and the administrative machinery of a satellite court. The contrast with London is striking.
In London and at the Thames palaces, river transport could move bulky goods efficiently. At Ludlow, overland networks mattered more. Winter roads could turn difficult. Seasonal shortages shaped options. Royal status could command the best available supplies, but it could not make strawberries appear in January, or preserve fresh sea fish indefinitely without planning. Arthur's death at 15 transformed every memory of his household into a dynastic tragedy. Contemporary observers described an illness that killed him quickly. Historians have proposed various possibilities, but certainty is impossible. The old popular phrase, sweating sickness, is often attached to the event, yet the evidence does not allow absolute confidence. What matters here is what people at the time believed illness meant. Diet, air, environment, season, bodily constitution, divine will, and contagion could all be discussed within different frameworks.
If food was restricted after illness began, that would have been normal medical care. Sick room diets tended toward foods thought easier to digest: broths, light meats, preparations designed to restore balance. The wealth of a prince did not protect him from ineffective medicine, nor did wealth guarantee appetite. Anyone who has watched a sick child turn away from food knows how quickly abundance becomes meaningless. A bowl prepared with the most expensive ingredients in England could still sit untouched beside a royal bed. This is the real emotional force hidden inside the clickbait. Not that Henry VII deliberately served revolting meals. Not that his sons staged a dramatic rebellion against bad cooking. The darker truth is that Tudor royalty lived inside a system where food was abundance without choice, medicine without microbiology, security without freedom, and ceremony without privacy. And the further we follow a single dish, the more that system reveals itself.
Take a joint of venison. Before it reaches the prince, a deer must exist inside a managed landscape. Someone must have the right to hunt it. Men and dogs must track it. The carcass must be dressed. Portions may be assigned as favours. The meat must travel. Clerks may record its arrival or distribution. Kitchen workers must prepare it. Firewood must be cut and transported. A cook must judge heat by experience rather than a digital thermometer. A servant must carry the finished dish through corridors where it loses heat with every step. Another servant may inspect, cover, uncover, carve, or present it. The diner receives the last few minutes of a process that has involved land law, class privilege, labour, transport, fuel, administration, and ritual. Now imagine that diner does not want it. The refusal is suddenly political, not because a child intends it to be, but because so many people and so much status are concentrated in the plate. In a modern home, wasted food is frustrating. In a royal household, waste can also expose disorder. Leftovers, however, were not necessarily thrown away. Food moved downward through hierarchies. Portions could be claimed by servants according to custom. Remaining food might reach dependents or the poor. Royal charity and household perquisites turned excess into another form of social structure. The same roast could begin as a sign of kingship and end as supper in a servant's lodging. Nothing at court was merely what it seemed.
The closer we look at ceremonial dining, the stranger the word meal becomes. At Henry VII's coronation and the great seasonal observances that followed, food was part of choreography. Surviving ceremonial records describe the ordering of royal feasts, and the very existence of such records tells us what mattered. Not merely whether guests were fed, but who entered, who served, which offices performed which duties, and how magnificence was made visible.
The court was a stage on which every motion could confirm hierarchy. Christmas was especially important.
In the first years after Bosworth, Henry celebrated Christmas as a victorious king, still teaching England what the new dynasty looked like. The season combined religion, hospitality, gift-giving, entertainment, and conspicuous consumption. For 12 days, the household's ordinary rhythm expanded into something more theatrical. Fires burned, musicians played, officers moved through halls crowded with retainers, clerks tracked expenses, great quantities of food arrived. Yet even celebration was regulated. The medieval court loved spectacle, but it loved ordered spectacle. The king's dining space could be physically separated from the larger household. Most people at court did not casually eat beside the monarch. The hall fed a ranked community. The king increasingly inhabited more private chambers, especially as royal domestic architecture evolved toward greater separation. Access itself became a currency. To be near the king while he ate could signify intimacy and favour. To be excluded could send a message just as powerful as a demotion written on parchment. So when we ask what Henry VII served at court, we are actually asking about several different tables operating at once. There was the food of the king. There was the food of the queen. There was the food of princes and princesses. There was the food of high nobles. There was the food of household officers. There was the food of grooms, pages, kitchen labourers, porters, stable workers, and countless others. There were fast day substitutions. There were sick-room diets. There were banquets and ordinary days. There was food sent as gifts, food received as gifts, food distributed as leftovers, food purchased in markets, food produced on royal lands, food taken from parks, and food brought in from overseas. The same palace could smell of imported cinnamon in one room and boiled beef in another. For lower-ranking servants, monotony was unavoidable. Bread, ale, beef, veal, or mutton formed the backbone of many institutional diets in the broader Tudor household tradition. A servant who lived at court might be better fed than many labourers outside, but that did not mean the meals were exciting. Food was part of wages. It was fuel for work. The servant did not choose a menu. If the allotted portion was cold, fatty, gristly, or late, he could not send it back to the kitchen with a complaint card. The royal family had more variety, but variety brought its own problems. Elite cookery valued presentation, rarity, and medical theory. A noble dish might be far removed from the simple appeal of hot bread or freshly roasted meat. Pottages could be thick. Meat pies might conceal mixtures of flesh, spice, fat, fruit, and sauce. Gelatins and jellies appeared in forms unfamiliar to a modern diner. Birds could be served with theatrical decoration. Sugarwork could be sculpted into objects designed to astonish before being eaten. The table was a place where food crossed into art, propaganda, and performance. One of the most revealing features of elite dining was the subtlety, an elaborate edible or partly edible display brought into a feast between courses. Later Tudor courts became famous for sugar sculpture, but the tradition had deep medieval roots. A subtlety might depict heraldic symbols, saints, allegorical figures, castles, or scenes with political meaning. Imagine a young prince watching a miniature world arrive on a platter, painted, gilded, sweetened, perhaps accompanied by verses or explanation. The object teaches him that power can be consumed. But spectacle does not make food safer. The greatest danger in a pre-modern kitchen was not necessarily malicious poison. It was ordinary contamination.
Raw meat, cooked food, dirty hands, wooden surfaces, standing water, rodents, insects, and waste all existed close together. Tudor people were not ignorant of cleanliness. They washed utensils, used cloths, maintained rules, and understood that foul smells and spoiled food could cause illness, even though they lacked germ theory. They could recognize obvious putrefaction. They knew fresh food from rotten food, but they could not see Salmonella, E. coli, or the microscopic mechanisms that make cross-contamination dangerous. That means the modern viewer should resist two opposite fantasies. The first is that every Tudor meal was crawling with visible rot. It was not. The second is that royal wealth created modern food safety. It did not. A palace kitchen could produce excellent food by contemporary standards and still expose diners to risks no refrigerator inspector would tolerate today. Fish was especially complicated. England's religious calendar demanded enormous fish consumption. Coastal fishing, river fisheries, fish ponds, and imported preserved fish all fed the system. Herring and cod could travel preserved in salt. Freshwater fish such as pike, bream, carp, perch, and eel could come from managed waters. Elite houses maintained ponds in part to guarantee supply. The rich could obtain impressive specimens. Sturgeon carried exceptional prestige and was associated with royal rights. Porpoise could appear in elite medieval menus, classified in ways that made it acceptable on fish days, despite being a mammal by modern taxonomy. To a Tudor diner, these foods communicated refinement. To a modern child, a heavily salted fish followed by almond-based pottage might feel like punishment. The future Henry VIII would become famous for appetite in popular imagination, but even his later court operated under fasting rules and medical advice. As a boy under Henry VII, he was shaped before that legendary appetite became part of his image. He learnt the ritual of controlled consumption. He learnt that a prince did not simply reach across a table. Servants presented, carvers carved. Cups were handled by designated officers. Napery was managed. Hands were washed before dining. Grace framed the meal. Rank determined order. Manners manuals from the period and surrounding decades reveal how much anxiety attached to the body at table. Do not spit carelessly. Do not wipe your nose on the tablecloth. Do not gnaw bones like an animal. Do not scratch yourself. Do not reach greedily. Do not put food back once it has touched your mouth. Do not behave as if alone. These rules were necessary precisely because people did the things being prohibited. A royal child had to learn them under observation. Picture the boy Henry sitting straight while adults watch. His clothes are expensive and restrictive compared with modern children's clothing. The room may be chilly away from the fire.
A tapestry softens drafts but does not create central heating. Wax candles and rushlights change the quality of light. Smoke darkens ceilings. A servant pours water over his hands. A towel is offered. The first dishes arrive. He is hungry, but hunger is not permission to grab. He waits for order. He eats with knife, spoon, fingers, and bread, according to the customs of his rank. He must not look ravenous. He must not look weak. Even appetite has etiquette. This is how a feast becomes discipline. The table also taught religion. Grace was not decorative. Food came from God within the worldview of the court. Fasting demonstrated obedience. Feasting demonstrated gratitude and status. The cycle of abstinence and abundance created a rhythm modern secular eating largely lacks. On a feast day, meat, pastry, wine, music and company could feel like release. On a fast day, even the richest household changed its kitchen operations. For children, that rhythm was learned young. A prince's religion was part of his political education. Arthur, named for legend but raised as a Christian ruler, was expected to embody piety. His brother Henry received an education strong enough that later observers praised his intellectual abilities. Both boys grew up in a world where theology entered the dining room. What you ate on Friday was not just nutrition, it was obedience to the church. Then came diplomacy, which could make dinner even heavier. When Catherine of Aragon arrived in England to marry Arthur, Food became part of international theatre. She was the daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, rulers whose prestige had risen dramatically after the conquest of Granada and the voyages across the Atlantic. Her marriage to Arthur represented one of Henry VII's greatest diplomatic achievements. It linked the Tudor dynasty to a powerful European royal house and helped demonstrate that Henry's family belonged among established monarchies.
The wedding took place at St Paul's in November 1501. London was transformed for the occasion. Pageants, processions, decorations, ceremonial entries and banquets turned the city into a political spectacle. Food followed the same logic. The purpose was not to make a teenage couple comfortable. The purpose was to make the marriage visible as an alliance. Imagine Catherine at a royal feast in a foreign country. She has crossed the sea. The language around her is unfamiliar. The manners are not exactly those of her childhood. English foodways differ from Iberian ones. The climate is colder and wetter. The court studies her face for clues. Every gesture can be interpreted. Does she eat? Does she smile? Does she appear healthy? Is she fertile? Is she pleased with her husband? Does she honour the king? A royal bride's appetite is public evidence. If she dislikes a dish, she cannot simply say so. Foreign ambassadors understood dining as information.
What a ruler served could indicate wealth. Who sat where could reveal favour. Which visitor received special dishes could signal diplomatic priority. Wine, plate, cloth, music and service created a language more subtle than speeches. A court that fed guests badly risked humiliation. A court that fed them extravagantly could project confidence. Henry VII knew the value of controlled impressions. His kingship depended on it. The irony is that the more politically important the meal, the less personal it became. Arthur and Catherine's wedding feast was about dynasty. Their actual tastes were secondary. The prince's body and the princess's body were vehicles for succession. People wanted them to eat enough to look healthy, but not because the court was primarily concerned with culinary happiness. Their bodies were investments. After the wedding celebrations, Arthur and Catherine eventually went to Ludlow. There the glitter faded into administrative routine. The prince held council.
Servants maintained the household. Meals continued. Winter pressed in. And then, within months, both Arthur and Catherine became ill. Arthur died on April 2nd, 1502. The shock travelled back to Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. The king and queen had built their dynasty around this boy. Chroniclers described their efforts to comfort one another. Elizabeth reminded Henry that they still had a surviving son. Henry, in turn, comforted her when her own grief overcame her. Whether every word reported is exact or polished by later memory, the scene captures the terror of monarchy. A kingdom can be won with soldiers and lost through fever. Suddenly, the younger Henry's plate mattered more than ever. There is a tendency to imagine royal abundance as protection from ordinary life. Arthur's death proves the opposite. The best rooms, richest clothes, most expensive spices, and most attentive servants could not guarantee survival.
In a world before antibiotics, modern diagnostics, vaccines against many childhood diseases, and knowledge of infectious transmission, a prince could die as suddenly as a peasant. Food, supposed to sustain life, sat inside this uncertainty. People knew that some foods made illness worse. They knew overeating could be harmful. They knew spoiled food could cause sickness. They knew that a weak stomach required gentler dishes. But their explanatory system could lead them toward treatments that did little, or actively harmed. A physician might adjust diet according to humoral qualities with great confidence, and no understanding of the pathogen actually killing the patient. That is why the phrase, "even his sons refused it," should not be treated as a literal archival quotation. The stronger story is not refusal, but surveillance. Arthur and Henry did not own their appetites in the way modern people imagine owning theirs. Their eating was watched because their survival was political. Henry VII understood political survival better than almost anyone around him. He had spent years in exile. He had lived with uncertainty, depended on foreign protection, crossed the channel to gamble everything on invasion, and defeated a crowned king in battle. That experience shaped his rule. He distrusted overmighty subjects. He used bonds and recognizances to enforce good behaviour. He pursued revenue aggressively. He cultivated capable administrators. Rebellions followed him through the reign. The Lambert Simnel Rising in 1487, the Perkin Warbeck Challenge in the 1490s, Cornish Rebellion in 1497. Each crisis reminded him that legitimacy could be contested. Food and hospitality operated inside that political environment. Feeding a nobleman at court brought him close enough to be watched. Bringing regional elites into the royal household tied them to the king's world. A place at dinner could flatter, exclusion could chill. Royal hospitality was soft power, backed by hard consequences. The kitchen itself was therefore part of government. Modern governments separate ministries from restaurants. Tudor monarchy did not. The royal household was simultaneously domestic establishment, political centre, ceremonial machine, employer, security system, and travelling city. Officers who managed food also participated in administration. The Board of Green Cloth in later Tudor form would oversee household expenditure and discipline. Clerks did not merely count onions, they were preserving order. Every missing loaf was a problem of accounting. The scale made theft inevitable. Servants could siphon provisions, exaggerate expenses, sell leftovers, substitute cheaper goods, or exploit customary fees. Household ordinances repeatedly tried to control waste, because waste was money, and money was royal power. Complaints about corruption in provisioning appear across pre-modern institutions because food is easy to lose between field and table. Suppose a supplier delivers a carcass weighing less than promised. Suppose a cook claims more firewood than he used. Suppose a servant takes wine meant for a superior. Suppose bread intended for a noble table disappears into a private room. None of these acts is dramatic enough for a chronicle, but multiplied across hundreds of people, they become a significant expense. Henry VII's reputation for financial scrutiny makes this especially vivid. A king attentive to revenue was not likely to view household leakage as charming tradition. His court had to look magnificent without becoming an uncontrolled drain. That tension could affect food quality. Institutional kitchens everywhere face the same structural problem. The person eating is often not the person buying. A clerk wants predictable cost. A cook wants workable ingredients. A servant wants his entitlement. A noble expects prestige. A physician wants dietary control. A religious calendar removes certain options. A supplier wants profit. The king wants splendour and economy at once. The plate at the end of that chain is a compromise, and compromises are rarely delicious. Consider temperature. Modern diners expect hot food to arrive hot. In a large palace, a joint might be cooked far from the chamber where it is eaten. It is placed on a dish, covered, carried through passages, perhaps held while officials arrange service, then brought into a hall. Winter air leaks through doors, stone corridors cool metal. By the time lower-ranking diners receive their portions, the fat may already be congealing. Royal diners could have better service, but ceremony itself caused delay. Presentation took time. Carving took time. Multiple dishes arrived together. A course, in medieval and Tudor dining, did not mean the modern sequence of starter, main, dessert. It could involve many dishes set out at once. A diner chose among what was available, while servants managed the display. The result was abundance at room temperature. Now consider texture. Meat was often cooked more thoroughly than a modern steakhouse patron might prefer. Large cuts and uncertain timing encouraged long cooking. Boiling before roasting could make service more efficient. Sauces restored moisture. Pies protected fillings and allowed transportation. For people accustomed to these techniques, the result was normal. For a modern audience expecting a medium-rare roast, it could feel ruined. Then consider salt. Salt preserved food, especially through winter and during transport. Preserved fish and meat could require soaking before cooking. If desalting was incomplete, the dish remained intensely salty. Even when properly prepared, preserved foods had textures and flavours shaped by curing. Elite access to fresh meat reduced dependence on preservation. but no court could live entirely outside the seasonal economy. Then consider smoke. Wood fires did not produce neutral heat. Smoke entered kitchens, soot settled, fuel choice affected aroma. Roasting near an open hearth created flavours some modern cooks deliberately seek, but in a crowded institutional kitchen, the smoke was not artisanal romance. It was occupational exposure. Then consider teeth. Late medieval dentistry was limited. Sugar, increasingly desirable among elites, could damage teeth. Coarse, stone-ground flour might contain grit, depending on milling and sifting, contributing to wear. Bones could splinter. Hard crusts demanded chewing. Toothache was common enough to make any feast miserable. A king could command swan, venison and spiced wine, but could not command a painless molar. The royal table looks different when we imagine everyone chewing carefully. Henry VII himself appears physically less theatrical in popular memory than his son, but his later years were marked by declining health. He became increasingly ill, probably with a pulmonary disease, and died at Richmond Palace in April 1509 at the age of 52. During periods of sickness, his diet would have mattered intensely. Rich food could be replaced by medical preparations. Appetite could fail. The palace might continue cooking for hundreds, while the man at its centre struggled to eat. There is a brutal symmetry in that image. Henry had spent a reign building abundance as proof of security. Near the end, abundance could do nothing for him. Yet before that ending, food remained one of the tools with which he staged kingship. In 1497, while rebellion threatened the realm, fire also struck the royal residence at Sheen. The palace was damaged and rebuilt. By 1501, Henry renamed it Richmond after his earldom. Brick, timber, glass, stone, labour and money reconstructed more than rooms. The palace itself became Tudor propaganda. Its kitchens and halls were part of the message. This dynasty was not temporary. It had a home. Today, most of Richmond Palace is gone. Fragments survive in later buildings and walls near Richmond Green. The Thames still moves past the site. Modern houses stand where servants once hauled provisions. Cars pass streets laid over a landscape that once smelled of horses, smoke, river mud, and roasting meat. The palace has vanished so thoroughly that it is easy to forget how alive it was. But the food system left traces in documents, because institutions remember expenses long after they forget sensations. A clerk may record a payment for wine without telling us whether it tasted sour. A household ordinance may specify portions without telling us who secretly hated them. A ceremonial account may list dishes without describing the smell in the hall. Historians work inside that silence. We can reconstruct what was purchased, what rules governed service, and what medical theory shaped choices. We cannot honestly invent a boy's exact complaint. So we have to listen differently. We listen to the repetition of preserved fish on fast days. We listen to the roar of hearths. We listen to the scrape of knives on trenchers. We listen to servants carrying dishes farther than food wants to travel. We listen to clerks arguing over waste. We listen to physicians discussing digestion. We listen to a court terrified that its heir might fall sick. From those sounds comes a truth more convincing than a fabricated quotation. At Henry VII's court, the problem was not that there was too little food. The problem was that food had become an institution. Once food becomes an institution, every mouth in the palace has a different relationship to it. For the king, it is sovereignty. For a nobleman, access. For a servant, wages. For a cook, labour. For a supplier, business. For a physician, treatment. For a priest, discipline. For a child, it can simply be the thing placed in front of him, whether he wants it or not. That last perspective is easy to lose, because Tudor royal children usually survive in portraits as miniature adults. Their clothes are formal, their posture is controlled, their futures are written into captions. But they began as infants in rooms crowded with nurses, attendants, wet nurses, rockers, laundresses, physicians and household officers. Before a prince could reject a roast, he had to survive milk. Infant feeding was dangerous across all social classes. Breastfeeding, often by a wet nurse in elite households, was the safest available source of nourishment when the nurse was healthy and lactating well. That people did not understand infectious disease as we do. Weaning introduced new risks. Softened bread, milk preparations, broths, cereal-based foods, and other transitional foods could become contaminated. Milk spoiled quickly. Water quality varied. Feeding vessels were difficult to sterilize. Diarrheal disease could kill with frightening speed. The Tudor royal nursery could afford better care, but it could not purchase germ theory. Henry VII and Elizabeth of York knew this reality personally. Not all of their children lived to adulthood. Arthur, Margaret, Henry, and Mary survived childhood, but Elizabeth died young. Edmund died as a small child, and the last baby, Catherine, died shortly after birth. Elizabeth of York herself died after giving birth to Catherine in 1503. The royal family's private losses were also public crises. Every nursery death narrowed the dynasty. Imagine the effect on food supervision. A surviving child becomes more precious after a sibling dies. A prince who seems pale attracts attention. A poor appetite is not merely annoying, it is a warning. Servants may coax him, a physician may recommend changes, a nurse may be blamed, a dish may be removed, another may be prepared. The household can produce almost anything available in England, yet the child may want nothing. This is one reason the word refused should be handled carefully. Royal children certainly refused food at times because all children do, but a documented pattern of Henry VII's sons rejecting their father's disgusting meals is another matter. The archive does not give us that simple story. What it gives us is a system in which refusal would have been noticed, interpreted, and managed. The system began long before the meal. At dawn, suppliers entered a world of inspection. Grain mattered because bread was foundational. Wheat had to be milled, flour bolted, dough mixed, ovens heated, loaves baked, counted, and distributed. Bread quality varied sharply by rank. Fine manchet bread required high-quality wheat and careful sifting. Coarser household bread could contain more bran. A loaf was not simply a loaf, it could identify the status of the person receiving it. Baking on a large scale demanded fuel. Fuel meant woodland, purchase contracts, transport, storage, and men moving heavy bundles. Every flame in the royal household consumed landscape. Roasting fires devoured timber, baking ovens consumed more. Heating chambers competed with cooking for fuel in cold weather. A palace could appear almost magical to a visitor, precisely because an invisible countryside was being burned to sustain it. The same was true of animals. Cattle, sheep, pigs, calves, and poultry had to be bred, fed, moved, slaughtered, dressed, and divided. Driving livestock to market cost weight, because animals lost condition on the road. Slaughter created blood, hides, fat, bones, organs, and waste, but little was automatically useless. Hides went into leather production. Tallow could become candles. Bones could be boiled or repurposed. Offal fed people lower in the hierarchy or entered specialised dishes. Pre-modern food economies were wasteful in some institutional ways and intensely economical in others. A kitchen might discard a spoiled item while saving a scrap of fat. The royal household's demand affected people far beyond the palace. Farmers grew grain, brewers malted barley, fishermen worked rivers and coasts, merchants imported wine, grocers handled spices, butchers supplied meat, poulterers dealt in birds, chandlers supplied wax and tallow, carters moved goods, boatmen carried heavy cargo along the Thames, coopers maintained barrels, smiths made and repaired knives, hooks, chains, spits, and ironwork. Potters and metalworkers produced vessels. Laundry workers cleaned cloths stained with grease and wine. The King's dinner employed England. London amplified this network. By Henry VII's reign, the capital was already a crowded commercial centre, whose markets and river traffic could support royal consumption. Streets were narrow, animals were driven through inhabited areas. Market stalls sold fish, meat, grain, fruit, vegetables, cheese, and prepared foods. Regulations attempted to control weights, measures, prices, and quality. Bad food was not a new problem. Urban authorities worried about stale fish, unwholesome meat, dishonest bakers, false measures, and contaminated goods because buyers complained and sickness had consequences, even if microbes remained invisible. A royal buyer had advantages. The crown could demand high standards, draw on estates, and use privileged suppliers. Yet no bureaucracy can inspect every onion. There was also a question of season. Modern supermarkets erase seasonality so effectively that it is difficult to imagine the emotional difference between a Tudor August and a Tudor February.
In late summer and autumn, fresh produce, fruit, and recently harvested grain could appear in abundance. Animals were often slaughtered before winter when fodder became scarce. Preservation intensified. By late winter, stored foods dominated. The texture of the diet changed with the calendar. A prince could be wealthier in January than almost anyone alive, and still live in January. No wealth could summon a modern global supply chain of fresh berries, refrigerated dairy, greenhouse salad, bananas, orange juice, and vegetables flown overnight across continents. Mediterranean products did reach elite English tables: citrus, almonds, olive oil, raisins, spices, wines, but they were luxuries shaped by transport and preservation. Each imported ingredient carried distance in its price. Sugar is perhaps the clearest example. To us, sugar is ordinary. To Henry VII's court, it was expensive, exotic, and politically useful as display. Sugar could be worked into decorative forms, used in medicinal preparations, and added to elite dishes. Its whiteness and refinement signalled expense. To put generous sugar on a table was to announce access to trade networks most subjects could never imagine. The same sugar that proclaimed wealth also damaged teeth. This pattern repeats throughout court food. The things that proved privilege often introduced new discomforts. Rich meat could be difficult to digest. Heavy drinking could worsen health. Sugar damaged teeth. Spices could irritate a sensitive stomach. Large, formal meals demanded prolonged sitting and self-control. Abundance encouraged overeating, while medical theory simultaneously warned against excess. Physicians inherited a long tradition of regimen, the management of health through air, exercise, sleep, evacuation, emotions, and food. A royal household could adjust diet with remarkable detail. If a person was believed too cold and moist, warming foods or spices might be recommended. If illness produced fever, the logic changed. Certain meats were considered more digestible than others. Young animals could be preferred for delicate stomachs. Broths and caudles could be used for invalids. Wine might be diluted. Foods could be cooked in ways thought to alter their qualities. To modernize, some of these rules look arbitrary. To the people enforcing them, they were science. A prince could therefore face the bizarre experience of being denied a favourite dish precisely because everyone around him believed they were protecting him. That is a familiar conflict even today, but at court the stakes were national. A royal physician's failure could damage a career. A successful recovery could bring reward. The kitchen staff had to translate theory into matter. A physician might recommend something light or warming, but a cook still had to produce it. That meant choosing ingredients, adjusting spices, controlling heat, and sending the dish through the same service channels as everything else. The boundary between food and medicine was porous. Sugar, spices, wine, herbs, syrups, conserves and broths appeared in both worlds. Apothecaries and cooks shared ingredients. A sweet preparation might be eaten for pleasure in one context and prescribed in another. Hippocras, wine flavoured with spices and sweetened, then strained, could be both luxury and digestive aid according to contemporary thinking. Now return to the boy Henry after Arthur's death. He is perhaps 10 years old when his brother dies. Within a year, his mother is dead. The emotional world of the palace contracts. His father never remarries, though diplomatic marriage possibilities are discussed. The younger Henry becomes Prince of Wales. His education and security become even more important. Later, when he becomes king at 17, Observers will describe him as handsome, athletic, musical, educated, and eager for display. The young Henry VIII initially represents a striking contrast to the guarded final years of Henry VII. This later contrast has encouraged a simple story. The father was gloomy and miserly, the son joyous and lavish. Food fits the stereotype perfectly. The father serves dreary fare, the son explodes into banquets. Reality is less convenient. Henry VII could spend lavishly when politics demanded it. His court celebrated magnificently. Henry VIII inherited many structures rather than inventing Tudor splendour from nothing. The enormous Hampton Court kitchens that survive today belong primarily to the next reign, developed after Cardinal Wolsey and then Henry VIII transformed the palace. They should not be projected backward, as if Henry VII personally walked their passages in the 1490s. Yet they preserve the logic of a Tudor court food system that had older roots. Specialised departments, controlled distribution, rank-based entitlements, vast fires, storerooms, serving routes, and the labour of hundreds. Walking through Hampton Court today can therefore help us imagine scale, but not exact architecture. Henry VII's kitchens at Richmond, Greenwich, Westminster and other residences differed. Much has vanished. The continuity lies in function rather than bricks. That distinction matters because historical reconstruction becomes false when atmosphere replaces chronology. It is tempting to place every Tudor in the same palace, under the same ceiling, eating the same menu. But Henry VII's England stood at a threshold. Medieval institutions remained powerful. Renaissance humanism was entering elite education. Printing had arrived in England only a generation earlier. Atlantic exploration was changing maps. The monarchy was consolidating after civil war.
Food stood between old and new worlds. At one end of the table sat medieval fasting rules and humoral medicine. At the other end lay imported luxuries, new diplomatic connections, and the early consequences of European expansion. Catherine of Aragon carried Iberian cultural expectations into this environment. Her parents' court had its own food traditions, shaped by Mediterranean agriculture, Islamic and Jewish culinary legacies, and regional Spanish practices. England's climate, ingredients, and preparation methods were different. Even where elite European courts shared spices, sugar, meats, and ceremonial dining, the familiar taste of childhood mattered. Homesickness has a flavour. A person can be surrounded by delicacies and long for a simple dish prepared the way it was at home. Catherine's later household in England maintained Spanish servants for a time, and diplomatic correspondence shows how intensely questions of household composition and money affected her life. Food would have been part of that domestic negotiation, even when records focus on larger political disputes. For Arthur, Catherine was both wife and alliance. For Henry VII, she was diplomatic capital. After Arthur died, the question of what would happen to her became entangled with her dowry, relations with Spain, and the possibility that she might marry the younger Henry. Years passed before that marriage occurred, after Henry VII's death. During those years, Catherine's finances were sometimes strained, and her household position became uncomfortable. The difference between a royal banquet and a royal budget can be brutal. A princess may own jewels and still struggle to maintain the daily expenses expected of her rank. She may dine beneath cloth of estate on one occasion and worry over household money on another. Magnificence is expensive because it must be repeated. A single feast is easy compared with feeding a court every day for years. This was Henry VII's great domestic problem. Kingship required repetition. Every morning the palace had to become a palace again. Bread had to appear again. Ale had to appear again. Meat or fish had to appear again. Candles had to appear again. Tables had to be laid again. Servants had to be paid or fed again. The great feast was remembered by chroniclers, but ordinary Tuesday consumed the treasury. That relentless expense explains the obsession with household regulation. Rules about who could eat where and how much they were entitled to were not petty bureaucracy. They were survival mechanisms for an institution that could be eaten into bankruptcy, one portion at a time. A person admitted to court brought appetites, and often servants of his own. If everyone fed everyone freely, numbers ballooned.
Noble households had the same problem on smaller scales. The royal household simply magnified it. Unauthorized hangers-on were not only a security concern, they were stomachs.
Food, therefore, policed membership. To receive bouche of court, the recognised allowance of food and other necessities associated with service, was a privilege. Later Tudor regulations detail these entitlements with striking precision. Although the surviving formulations are better documented under Henry VIII, the administrative impulse long predates him. A courtier knew that rank could be converted into bread, wine, fuel, candles, and lodging. That makes the palace resemble a company town, military headquarters, monastery, theatre, and government ministry all at once. The king's sons grew up inside that machine. They learned early that people's meals depended on office. Their own tables depended on office too. The difference was that their portions were better and their bodies more valuable. What would a normal day's taste have been?
We cannot write a single menu for every year of Henry VII's reign, but the wider late medieval English pattern is clear enough to imagine the palate. Bread accompanies nearly everything. Ale is common. Wine appears more frequently at elite tables. Potages range from simple broths to complex thickened preparations. Beef and mutton are staples. Pork appears. Poultry can include chicken, capon, goose, duck, and game birds. Venison carries elite prestige. Rabbits are eaten. Fish transforms fast days. Eggs and dairy appear according to religious restrictions and season. Peas, beans, onions, leeks, cabbage, herbs, and other vegetables contribute to potages and sides, though elite records often foreground expensive animal foods. Fruit may be cooked rather than eaten raw because medical theory could regard raw fruit with suspicion. Apples, pears, plums, cherries, and imported dried fruits appear in different forms. Almonds are extraordinarily useful because almond milk can enrich dishes when dairy is restricted. Spices provide colour as well as taste. Saffron makes a dish golden. Cinnamon and ginger add warmth. Vinegar and verjuice add acidity. To modern ears, some combinations sound adventurous. To modern stomachs, a week of them might feel punishing. Imagine breakfast, or rather the lack of a modern breakfast routine. Meal timing differed by class, age, and circumstance. The main dinner could occur in the late morning, supper in the afternoon, or early evening. People rising at dawn might take something earlier, but the modern pattern of cereal at 8, lunch at 1, dinner at 7 is irrelevant. At court, formal meal hours aligned with institutional life. A child's schedule could differ, especially in nursery years, but as princes entered formal household routines, they learned the court's clock. Hunger arrived when the body wanted it. Food arrived when rank and schedule permitted it.
The room itself changed the experience. Great halls were impressive but not cosy. High roofs swallowed heat. Doors opened constantly. Rushes or other floor coverings could trap debris. Tapestries reduced drafts and displayed wealth. Dogs might be present in household environments despite efforts to control them. Servants moved continuously. Musicians or conversation created noise. Smoke from candles and hearths mixed with food smells. A dish that might be pleasant in a quiet, modern dining room becomes something else when eaten amid hundreds of bodies in wool clothing. Royal privacy solved some discomforts, but introduced others. Eating in a private chamber meant fewer crowds, yet it made every attendant more visible. There is nowhere to hide a grimace when the people around you exist to watch your face. A prince's refusal, if it happened, could be silent. A piece left untouched. A cup barely sipped. A crust broken, but not eaten. The clerk may never record it. The plate moves away.
History loses the moment. This is why material details matter so much. They let us reconstruct pressure without inventing dialogue. Take the knife. Diners often brought or used personal knives. The fork had not yet become a normal English table utensil. Spoons served liquid foods. Fingers were expected tools, used according to etiquette. Hand washing before meals was therefore essential. Servants brought basins and ewers. Clean linen signalled refinement. The absence of forks did not mean people were savage. It meant the etiquette system was different. The same is true of shared dishes. Several diners might eat from a common mess, meaning a portion assigned to a small group. Sharing food reinforced hierarchy and companionship. It also increased opportunities for contamination. Everyone's hands, knives, breath, and habits mattered. A royal child learned social disgust alongside taste. He learned which behaviour was low. He learned whose touch was acceptable. He learned that clean linen meant status. He learned to distinguish the greasy labour of the kitchen from the polished service of the chamber, even though the one made the other possible. Below, the cooks sweated. Above, the prince was expected not to notice. This division is essential to court magnificence. Wealth is the successful concealment of labour. The guest sees silver, not the boy turning the spit. He sees a golden pastry crust, not the woman or man who cleaned the baking equipment. He sees wine poured smoothly, not the barrel dragged through a cellar. He sees a tablecloth, not the laundress wresting grease from linen. Henry VII's court was full of invisible people making visible monarchy. For them, bad food meant something different again. A kitchen worker might spend all day surrounded by meat he was not entitled to eat in the same form as the king. He might receive leftovers or a prescribed allowance. He might be exhausted by heat and have little appetite.
He might drink ale because it was part of his ration. He might sleep near the workplace or in crowded lodgings. Court employment offered security and opportunity, but it also consumed bodies. The smell of roasting meat could be a privilege you served rather than enjoyed. That is the social cruelty hidden inside the banquet image. A feast gathers inequality into one room and calls it harmony. No story exposes that inequality more perfectly than Lambert Simnel. In 1487, only 2 years after Bosworth, Henry VII faced a rebellion built around a boy. The child was presented as Edward, Earl of Warwick, a Yorkist claimant with royal blood. He was crowned in Dublin. Yorkist leaders, Irish supporters, and continental mercenaries rallied around the imposture. The rising ended at the Battle of Stokefield in June 1487, a savage engagement often described as the final major battle of the Wars of the Roses. Henry won.
The adults who had engineered the rebellion faced the consequences of treason. The boy, however, was treated differently. Henry recognised that Simnel had been used. Rather than execute him, the king humiliated the entire conspiracy by putting the false king to work in the royal kitchens as a scullion. Later he became a falconer. The symbolism could hardly be sharper. A boy who had been crowned as king was made to work among dirty dishes, grease, ash, water, and food scraps for the real king. At Henry VII's court, the kitchen was not just a workplace, it could become political theatre. Imagine Simnel entering the service corridors. Months earlier men had called him sovereign. They had dressed him for ceremony, taught him manners, placed a crown on his head, and marched soldiers in his name. Now he is surrounded by steam and smoke. He scrubs, he carries, he works below stairs while Henry Tudor eats above. Every tray that passes him tells the same story. There is one king, and you are not he. This is one of the most extraordinary reversals in English royal history, and it makes the kitchen central to Henry VII's method of rule. Execution would have turned Simnel into a dead child. Kitchen service turned him into a living joke against the king's enemies. Henry converted mercy into propaganda. The food itself became part of the punishment, not because it was disgusting to eat, but because serving it marked status. That distinction matters. In a hierarchical household, the difference between diner and scullion could be more important than the difference between beef and fish. One person consumed power, another washed the plate. Scullions occupied the dirtiest end of the culinary chain. Pots blackened by fire had to be cleaned. Grease had to be scraped. Water had to be hauled or managed. Floors needed attention. Ash and waste accumulated. The work was wet, hot, repetitive, and low status. Later Tudor regulations famously complained about kitchen workers lying around by fires and wearing filthy clothing, evidence that the service areas of royal palaces could be rough places despite the splendour produced for rooms above. Simnel's survival also tells us something about Henry VII. The king could be ruthless, but he could distinguish between a useful enemy and a dangerous one. He did not need the boy dead. he needed the rebellion discredited. A royal kitchen offered the perfect stage because everyone understood the social distance between the throne and the sink. Food carried humiliation without a speech. The same court would later confront Perkin Warbeck, a more persistent pretender who claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, one of the princes believed to have disappeared in the Tower. Warbeck gained support abroad, exploited Yorkist uncertainty, and repeatedly threatened Henry's security before being captured.
His fate was harsher. After escape attempts and renewed danger, he was executed in 1499. Between Simnel and Warbeck, Henry's household lived under constant awareness that a meal could occur while somewhere beyond the walls men were plotting to replace the man eating it. Security around the royal body becomes easier to understand in that context. The cupbearer is not merely decorative. The route from kitchen to chamber matters because access matters. The people who touch the king's food are physically close to the person on whom government depends. Trust is edible. One should not imagine every cook as a potential assassin. Most were workers trying to survive a demanding job, but the fear of poisoning had a cultural power larger than the number of actual poisonings. Medieval and Renaissance rulers knew famous stories of poisoned cups, poisoned dishes, poisoned medicines, and treacherous servants. Political rumour turned sudden illness into suspicion. If a king vomited after dinner, bad fish and assassination could occupy the imagination at the same time. Food therefore passed through ritual, partly because ritual reassured. The royal table was covered with cloth. Hands were washed. Serving officers were known. Dishes were carried in processions. Carving occurred under observation. Cups were guarded. The very slowness that could make food cool also made service legible. Everyone could see that the correct people had performed the correct actions. A modern restaurant hides the kitchen because diners trust regulation. A royal court displayed service because trust was personal. That display reached beyond food into plate. Gold and silver vessels represented portable wealth. A magnificent cup could be melted down in crisis. Plate was inventory, art, propaganda, and reserve capital at once. The king's table might glitter because the monarchy wanted visitors to see solvency. Henry VII understood movable wealth particularly well. His reign strengthened royal finances through customs, feudal dues, judicial penalties, bonds, and other mechanisms. His later financial methods created deep resentment, especially through ministers such as Edmund Dudley and Richard Empson. When Henry VIII succeeded in 1509, he moved quickly against them, sacrificing two symbols of his father's unpopular fiscal regime. But before the old king died, money and magnificence remained intertwined. A feast could consume expensive ingredients, yet much of its visual power came from things that were not eaten: cloth of gold, tapestries, plate, liveries, furniture, music, heraldic decoration, architecture, and bodies arranged in rank. The food was one element of a total environment. This helps explain why a dish could taste mediocre without ruining the event. A diplomatic banquet was not judged like a tasting menu. Its success lay in scale, order, generosity, symbolism, and the honour shown to guests. If the venison was slightly overdone but arrived on silver beneath banners in a hall packed with nobles, the political message survived. For a child, however, politics is a poor source. Arthur and Henry experienced court food before they could fully understand why it mattered. They were trained into its meanings. Over time, they learned that some dishes signalled feast days, some marked fasting, some belonged to illness, some appeared with high guests, and some were routine. Taste became memory. What might young Henry have associated with his father's table after Arthur and Elizabeth of York died? The documents do not tell us. It would be wrong to invent a scene of the boy staring bitterly at a plate while Henry VII lectures him. Yet the emotional atmosphere of the later court is documented as increasingly constrained. The king's health declined. Financial enforcement hardened. The surviving heir was precious. The Queen's absence changed domestic life. A room can keep the same furniture and become colder after a death. food can do the same. A dish served during childhood celebration tastes different when the people who once shared the room are gone. Henry VII's household had to maintain normality through these losses. That is what institutions do. A bell rings. Dinner is served. Accounts close. Servants change shifts. Meat roasts. Fish is salted. Bread rises. Grief is forced to obey schedule. Outside the palace, ordinary Londoners had a very different relationship with food. The city's poor spent a large proportion of income on basic staples. Bread prices mattered intensely because grain prices could determine whether a family ate adequately. Ale provided calories as well as drink. Pottage stretched vegetables, grains, and small amounts of meat across multiple mouths. Cheese and onions were practical foods. Fresh meat was less regular for the poor than for the elite, though urban diets varied widely by occupation and income. The contrast at the palace gate could be brutal. Inside, a noble table might leave food uneaten because etiquette, abundance, and surplus made finishing everything unnecessary. Outside, people could wait for distributions, charity, leftovers, or alms. Great households had traditions of giving food to the poor, especially on religious occasions. This charity was real and could matter to recipients. It also reinforced hierarchy. The king gave because he had enough to give. The poor received because they did not. A leftover crust could become royal propaganda. The recipient might not care. Hunger simplifies politics. This downward movement of food means the quality of court meals cannot be judged only at the high table. A joint might be freshest when served to the king, cooler when passed to a gentleman, and cold by the time scraps reach a servant or petitioner. Fat congeals, sauces separate, bread hardens. What begins as luxury ends as survival. The palace consumed animals in layers. Prime cuts travelled upward, labour travelled downward. The same logic applied to freshness. High-status diners had greater access to fresh meat and delicate dishes. Lower-status workers relied more on robust preparations that could be produced in quantity. Institutional food has always been stratified by how much attention can be spent on one person's plate. A king's cook can worry about sauce. A scullion worries about the pot. This is why later Tudor kitchen complexes were divided into specialised departments. Great kitchens roasted meat. Boiling houses handled large-scale boiling. Pastry departments made crusts. Larders stored provisions. Cellars managed wine and ale. Confectionery, spicery, poultry, and other offices could operate with separate staffs and responsibilities. Henry VII's exact arrangements varied by residence and did not mirror the later Hampton Court plan, but specialisation was already fundamental to elite household management. Specialisation improves efficiency while creating bureaucracy. A dish can fail because one department is late. The pastry is ready before the filling. The meat arrives before the haul. The sauce cools while a servant waits for precedence. A clerk refuses an ingredient because the authorization is wrong. A supplier substitutes lower quality goods. The king's dinner is vulnerable to paperwork. That sounds modern because institutions remain institutions. Imagine a fasting Friday during winter. The household needs fish for hundreds. Some fresh fish arrives from nearby waters. Preserved cod or herring supplements it. Salt must be managed. Almonds are ground for milk. Bread thickens sauces. Eels wriggle in containers before preparation. The fish kitchen smells sharp and damp. Workers scale, gut, wash, chop, boil, bake or fry depending on the dish. Bones and skin accumulate. The stone is cold underfoot. Upstairs, a prince sees only the final platter. He may have eaten similar fish last Friday, and the Friday before that. And during Lent, the repetition intensifies. This is where royal abundance becomes monotonous in a way modern people underestimate. Variety within a restricted category is still restriction. A court might serve pike one day, eel another, salt cod another, elaborate fish pies, almond dishes, and sweetened preparations. The kitchen could be imaginative, but a child craving roast meat during a long sequence of abstinence would not be impressed by the creativity. Religious discipline trained desire by denying it. Fasting also reveals a common misunderstanding about medieval food. Fast did not always mean small portions. Elite fast day meals could be lavish. The prohibition centered on categories of food, not necessarily on calories. A rich household could turn abstinence into extravagance, with expensive fish, imported fruit, almonds, wine, and elaborate sauces. This apparent contradiction made moralists uneasy. If a meatless feast cost more than a simple meat dinner, had the spirit of fasting survived? Court culture lived inside that tension between piety and display. Henry VII cultivated an image of religious seriousness. He funded religious foundations, maintained devotions, and planned an extraordinary chapel at Westminster Abbey as his dynastic mausoleum. The Lady Chapel that bears his name still stands as one of the most elaborate monuments to Tudor kingship. Stone lace rises overhead where food cannot follow. The king who managed earthly abundance spent heavily to prepare his memory for eternity. At table, the same man obeyed a calendar that reminded him wealth could not cancel God. His sons were taught the same lesson. Arthur's very name invoked legendary kingship, but his daily life was Christian. Henry would later become the centre of England's break with Rome, yet as a child he grew inside orthodox late medieval Catholic practice. The Reformation was not waiting in the nursery as destiny. On Fridays, the future supreme head of the Church of England ate according to the rules of the Church he would one day defy. History makes ordinary meals ironic only after the fact. A bowl of fish pottage in the 1490s contains no reformation. It is simply dinner. That is why the best historical reconstruction resists prophecy. We must see the boy before the king. Young Henry does not know about Anne Boleyn, the monasteries, 6 marriages, the field of cloth of gold, obesity, ulcerated legs, or the executions that will define his later image. He knows tutors, siblings, prayers, games, clothes, servants, horses, music, ceremonies, and food. His father's court teaches him what monarchy tastes like. It tastes of roast meat on feast days. It tastes of fish on fast days. It tastes of wine, diluted or controlled according to age and custom. It tastes of bread at every meal. It tastes of spice, because spice is wealth. It tastes of sugar, because sugar is prestige. It tastes of smoke, because fire is the kitchen's engine. It tastes of salt, because preservation is survival. And sometimes, surely, it tastes of something he does not want. But the plate is not a democracy. That may be the simplest way to understand royal food under Henry VII. The king possessed more choice than almost anyone in England, yet even he was constrained by season, religion, medicine, security, ceremony, supply, and the expectations of kingship. His sons possessed less choice because their bodies belonged to the dynasty. The court could command 1,000 servants. It could not command appetite. And appetite was only one of the uncontrollable forces surrounding a royal meal. Fire was another. A palace depended on flame. Flame-cooked meat, boiled water, heated rooms, baked bread, warmed sauces, melted wax, provided light and dried clothing. It was everywhere because there was no alternative. That made every royal residence vulnerable. Timber roofs, wooden partitions, rushes, cloth hangings, stored fuel, grease, and open hearths created a landscape in which a moment of carelessness could become catastrophe. At Christmas in 1497, the palace at Sheen suffered a major fire. The exact origin should not be romanticised into a kitchen accident without evidence, but the event reminds us how fragile these supposedly permanent royal worlds were. Henry rebuilt. By 1501, the residence was known as Richmond Palace, named after his own title, Earl of Richmond. A fire had destroyed space. The king answered with architecture and identity. Even rebuilding had a food dimension. A palace was not functional until it could feed people. Great chambers might impress ambassadors.
but kitchens, bakehouses, breweries, larders, cellars, wells, drains, stables, and landing places made residence possible. A king cannot hold court in a beautiful shell if 500 people have nowhere to eat. The travelling nature of monarchy made this problem repeat across multiple houses. Henry VII moved between royal residences and the homes of major subjects. The court followed. Travelling with a monarch meant transporting clothing, documents, plate, beds, tapestries, servants, horses, weapons, and enormous quantities of supplies. Local communities might be expected to provide provisions or services. The arrival of the king could be an honour and an economic shock at the same time. A royal visit consumed a neighbourhood. Horses needed fodder, servants needed bread, fires needed fuel, animals had to be slaughtered, wine had to be found, beds had to be prepared, waste had to be removed, roads filled with carts, inns overflowed. Prices could rise when demand surged. For noble hosts, hospitality was a test. To entertain the king inadequately could be humiliating. To entertain him magnificently could be financially ruinous. Great houses therefore stored plate, linens, preserved food, and household equipment for moments when status had to become visible overnight. Henry's movements also changed freshness. At a settled palace near London, supply chains could become routine. On progress, cooks depended more heavily on what could be obtained locally or transported. Preserved foods became more important. A court on the move carried its hierarchy with it, but could not carry every convenience. The royal children moved less freely than modern families on holiday. Travel was logistics. Roads were rough. Weather mattered. Luggage was enormous. A child could spend hours on horseback, in a litter, or in a carriage-like vehicle depending on age and circumstance, then arrive at a residence where servants had been rushing to prepare rooms before the household descended. Dinner after such a journey might be abundant and late. No prince would call room service. Hunting created a more direct connection between movement and food. Royal and aristocratic hunting was sport, military training, social ritual, and resource management. Deer parks represented controlled nature. The chase allowed the king and nobleman to display horsemanship, endurance, weapons skill, and masculine identity. Afterwards, the animal entered a ritual of division. Different parts could be allocated by custom. Venison might be sent as a prestigious gift to someone who had never seen the hunt. Henry VII was not remembered as the athletic hunting icon his son later became, but hunting remained part of courtly culture. The future Henry VIII embraced it enthusiastically. As a boy, he learned that venison came with stories of rank: who killed the deer, who received which portion, whose park supplied it, who was honoured by a gift. A slice of meat could carry a relationship. This gift economy complicates household accounts. Not all food was purchased at market price. Some arrived as gifts from subjects seeking favour. Some came as customary obligations. Some came from royal demesnes. Some was produced by estates. Some was acquired through office. The flow of provisions was therefore partly commercial and partly political. If a bishop sent fish, a nobleman sent venison, or a town presented wine, the gift fed the household and spoke at the same time. Refusing such a gift could insult the giver. Serving it could honour him. Giving part of it onward could create another obligation. Food moved through patronage like letters. For Henry's sons, this meant that even the origin of a dish could matter. A particular deer might have been sent by a powerful lord. A special wine might honour an ambassador. A sweet dish might mark a saint's day or marriage negotiation. A prince did not need to understand every layer to participate in the performance. He only had to sit where he belonged and eat correctly. The Queen's household added another centre of consumption. Elizabeth of York was not simply Henry VII's wife in private. She was queen, mother of the dynasty, patron, employer, and head of her own household structures. Her chambers had officers and servants. Her pregnancies changed dietary needs. Childbirth required special arrangements. Churching after birth involved religious ceremony. Her health, clothing, jewels, almsgiving, entertainments, and meals all carried political meaning. The image of Henry's court as a purely masculine dining machine is therefore false. Women were everywhere in the domestic royal world. Queen's ladies, nurses, laundresses, seamstresses, servants, wives of officers, market workers, brewers and suppliers. Their labour is often less visible because records privilege formal offices held by men, but the household could not function without women. Brewing is a good example. Across medieval England, ale production had long been associated with women at household and commercial levels, though larger-scale brewing increasingly professionalised and masculinised in some towns. A court consuming huge quantities of drink depended on a wider economy in which women's labour remained significant. Laundry is another. Dining generated cloth, tablecloths, napkins, towels, aprons. Clean linen was a marker of refinement. Grease, wine, soot, sweat and food stains had to be removed without modern detergent, washing machines or piped hot water.
Laundresses used labour, water, lye-like substances, soap where available, beating, rinsing, drying and bleaching in sunlight. Every white cloth on the king's table was someone else's red hands in cold water. The palace aesthetic depended on bodies it tried not to show. This invisibility helps explain why modern recreations can be misleading. We visit a preserved Great Hall and see polished stone. We see ropes protecting furniture, controlled lighting, clean floors, interpretive signs, and no smell of livestock. The real court was noisier, dirtier, more crowded, and more alive. A historic room without servants is like a theatre after the audience leaves. To reconstruct Henry VII's food world, we must put people back into the architecture. Put a baker in the bakehouse before dawn. Put a boy carrying wood across a wet courtyard. Put a clerk leaning over a tally. Put a poulterer delivering birds. Put a butcher with blood on his sleeves. Put a laundress lifting soaked linen. Put a groom stealing a mouthful in a passage. Put a nobleman waiting to learn whether he has been invited near the king. Put a prince staring at a fish dish he has eaten too many times. Put Henry VII behind a guarded door reading financial papers while his meal cools. Now the palace breathes. The sounds are constant. Knives on boards, cleavers against bone, water sloshing into tubs, logs cracking, pots scraping, dogs barking, horses stamping, bells calling people to worship or marking household rhythms, servants shouting names, doors slamming, cups touching tables, musicians tuning, a priest murmuring grace, somewhere a child crying, somewhere an officer swearing because the wine has not arrived. The smell is even stronger. Fresh bread competes with manure. Roasting meat competes with drains. Beeswax competes with tallow. Herbs compete with sweat. Wine competes with damp stone. A palace is not one smell, but a war of smells. For a prince raised from birth inside it, this would not necessarily seem disgusting. Familiarity is powerful. The future Henry VIII did not walk into a Tudor kitchen with a 21st century nose. Smoke, animal fat, damp wool, horse dung and wood fire belonged to the ordinary sensory world of elite life as much as velvet and incense did. What would disgust him were breaches of his own culture's expectations. Spoiled meat, visibly dirty service, foul vessels, bad manners, low-quality bread in the wrong setting, improper rank, or food considered medically unsuitable. This is why we cannot translate bad directly across 5 centuries. Modern viewers often imagine Tudor food through myths. One myth says spices were used to hide rotten meat. In reality, spices were too expensive to waste routinely on meat recognised as rotten, and people knew rotten meat was dangerous, or at least undesirable, even without microbiology. Strong flavour does not imply decay. Another myth says everyone drank alcohol because water was universally lethal. In reality, people drank water when clean sources were available. The royal household's access to managed supplies made water practical in many contexts. Another myth says vegetables were absent from elite tables. They were less celebrated in surviving accounts than expensive meats, but onions, leeks, herbs, peas, beans, cabbage, roots, and other plant foods were part of the diet. The real dangers are less theatrical and more believable. Inconsistent preservation, cross-contamination, poor storage, parasitic infection, contaminated water in some places, spoiled dairy, under-recognized foodborne disease, excessive salt, heavy drinking, dental decay, nutritional imbalance, and medical interventions based on incorrect physiology. Royal wealth reduced exposure to hunger and increased exposure to excess. That reversal is important. Poor households worried about not getting enough calories. Elite households could suffer diseases associated with rich diets, although diagnosis is difficult. Gout later became culturally associated with wealth because diets rich in meat and alcohol could contribute to it, though genetics and other factors matter. Dental caries worsened among those who could afford sugar. Obesity became possible for people insulated from hard physical labour and surrounded by food, though many courtiers remained active through riding, hunting, dancing, martial exercise and travel. The young Henry VIII is a reminder that a person can begin athletic and end physically damaged. His later health cannot be reduced to one cause, but the transformation dramatises the long-term tension inside royal abundance. Food that once signalled vitality could become part of a regime of excess. Henry VII's own table seems more controlled in popular memory, consistent with his reputation. Yet restraint did not mean simplicity. A king could eat less than his household prepared. The point of abundance was partly that it existed around him. This distinction between provision and consumption is crucial. A royal menu listing many dishes does not prove the king ate all of them. Courses presented choices. Dishes fed attendants and favoured diners. Leftovers moved elsewhere. To imagine Henry personally devouring every listed animal is to misunderstand service. The same applies to his sons. Being presented with numerous foods does not mean they consumed them all. A prince could select small portions under guidance. A sick prince might be restricted. A fasting prince might avoid meat. A child might nibble bread and leave an elaborate dish untouched. A plate returning to the kitchen does not explain itself. The scullion sees what remains, but not why. Perhaps the prince disliked the taste. Perhaps he was ill. Perhaps etiquette required leaving some food. Perhaps the dish was decorative. Perhaps he had already eaten enough from another plate. Perhaps a physician stopped him. Perhaps it had gone cold. Historical evidence rarely lets us choose. This uncertainty should not weaken the story. It should sharpen it. The temptation to invent a dramatic refusal exists because we want a human moment inside institutional records. But the institution itself is human. Every rule was written because someone once caused a problem. Every ration existed because someone once argued over entitlement. Every inspection reflects fear of fraud. Every ceremony reflects fear of disorder. The household rules are fossilized conflict. If an ordinance says kitchen staff must not steal, someone stole. If it says unauthorized persons must not eat, unauthorized persons ate. If it says servants must keep proper hours, someone disappeared. If it says food must be carried in a certain way, someone mishandled it. If it says waste must be controlled, waste was happening. The perfection visible in ceremonial art sat above permanent administrative irritation. Henry VII was well suited to irritation. He valued control. His financial policies relied on documentation, obligation, and enforcement. Men who underestimated his attention to detail could discover that the king remembered debts years later. The household was one more place where numbers created leverage. Yet even Henry could not eliminate waste, because waste was built into magnificence. To prove abundance, the court had to display more than strict necessity. To feed according to rank, it had to maintain multiple levels of provision. To hold feasts, it had to prepare for guests whose attendance could change. To maintain charity and perquisites, it had to generate surplus. Economy and splendour pulled in opposite directions.
The king spent his reign holding the rope between them. His sons learned from opposite ends. Arthur was trained to inherit the controlled Tudor monarchy. Henry inherited it unexpectedly and then expanded its spectacle. One son died before he could test his father's system. The other transformed it so dramatically that his image almost erased the man who built the foundation. Today, most people can picture Henry VIII before they can picture Henry VII. They see the broad face, jewelled cap, square shoulders, and massive body from Holbein's iconic image. Henry VII appears thinner, darker, more remote, hands folded around a red rose in later portraits. The contrast invites a culinary fantasy, the thin father rationing everything, the huge son demanding endless meat. But portraits are not menus. Henry VIII became large later in life. As a young man, he was admired for athleticism. Henry VII could sponsor lavish hospitality despite personal caution. The difference between them was political style as much as appetite. Still, there is one sense in which the younger Henry may genuinely have experienced his father's court as restrictive.
After Arthur's death, his exposure to the world was tightly managed. He was the sole surviving male heir. A cautious father, who had survived 2 major pretender crises, had every reason to limit risk. The prince's companions, movements, and access to information mattered. Food would naturally fall within that protected environment. Who could dine with him? Who could serve him? What could he drink? What should he eat when ill? Who was responsible if something went wrong? These were not casual questions. The prince's body was a fortress softer than stone. Every meal opened the gate. This is why royal tasting rituals, trusted servants, covered dishes, and controlled access were psychologically powerful. Even if poison was unlikely, the possibility turned dining into vulnerability. The king could wear armour in battle. At dinner, he had to swallow something another person had touched. Power becomes intimate at the mouth.
A ruler can order executions and still be killed by a contaminated oyster. A dynasty can command armies and still collapse through fever. Henry VII knew this not as philosophy, but as family experience. Arthur was gone. Elizabeth of York was gone. Several younger children were gone. Only Henry remained to carry the male Tudor line. So imagine the surviving prince at dinner in the last years of his father's reign. Not a proven scene, but a historically grounded possibility. The room is guarded. His attendants know he is watched. The meal is good by the standards of elite England. Fine bread, perhaps roasted meat on a flesh day, sauce sharpened with wine or verjuice, a sweetened dish, fruit cooked with spice, ale or wine under control. Nothing is rotten. Nothing is deliberately cruel. And still, the boy may feel trapped. He cannot choose the hour. He cannot choose the company. He cannot choose the religious calendar. He cannot choose whether physicians worry about him.
He cannot choose not to be the heir. The unpleasantness of the meal is not in the recipe. It is in the lack of escape. To understand how complete that lack of escape could be, follow the court through a year. January begins in cold. The great Christmas celebrations may still echo in the household, but the countryside beyond the palace is stripped down to winter. Stored grain matters. Preserved meat matters. Salt fish matters. Root vegetables, onions, dried peas, beans, cheese, dried fruit, nuts, and whatever fresh supplies can be obtained fill gaps. The royal household can purchase luxuries, but the season remains visible. Fires burn constantly, smoke clings to clothing, water is painfully cold in service areas. A cook working close to the hearth may sweat, while a servant carrying the dish through a passage can see his breath. The prince receives dinner between these climates. February brings the approach of Lent, depending on the calendar.
Shrovetide is a brief threshold of consumption before restriction.
Eggs, fat, and foods soon to be limited can be used more freely. Then the kitchen changes gear. Lent is not one bad Friday. It is weeks of institutional adaptation. The slaughter and roasting of ordinary flesh meat decline for those observing the rules. Fish procurement surges. Almonds become even more important because almond milk can replace animal dairy in many preparations.
Cooks must create variety from permitted categories. Dried and salted fish requires soaking and preparation. Fresh fish must move quickly. Pies, potages, sauces and baked dishes provide changing textures. Imported spices and fruit keep elite tables luxurious. The royal household can make abstinence expensive. For workers, however, Lent may mean more repetitive labour. Fish is messy. Scales scatter. Smell penetrates clothing. Salt dries hands. Large quantities must be cleaned and portioned.
A feast of piety upstairs may be a week of raw fingers downstairs. Then Easter arrives, and meat returns with ceremonial force. The contrast matters. After weeks of abstinence, roasted flesh tastes different. Religious rhythm intensifies appetite by interrupting it. The feast is not merely a menu change, but a release. Bells, worship, clothing, music, gifts and dining combine into renewal. A child learns the year through his stomach. Spring brings young animals, fresh herbs, new greens, and the gradual widening of available produce. Lamb and veal can appear at elite tables. Eggs are plentiful. Dairy improves as animals graze. The countryside greens. Royal residences become easier to supply. Roads dry somewhat. Travel increases. Summer shifts the sensory world again. Heat threatens meat and fish. Fresh produce expands, but kitchens become brutal. The same fires needed for roasting now burn inside already warm buildings. Flies multiply. Smells intensify.
Food must be processed quickly. Servants carrying dishes through crowded rooms sweat under wool and livery. The high table may look cool beneath linen. The kitchen is not. Summer also favours travel, hunting and outdoor entertainment. Fruit becomes more available. Cherries, berries and early varieties appear, depending on region and cultivation. Elite diners may receive delicate produce that never appears in bulk household accounts, because it comes through gardens, gifts or small purchases. Herbs perfume sauces, flowers decorate spaces. The court briefly seems to defeat the harshness of the environment. Then a thunderstorm breaks. Roads become mud. A delivery is delayed. The illusion collapses. Autumn brings harvest and slaughter. Grain fills stores if the year has been good. Apples and pears are gathered. Nuts and fruit can be dried or stored. Animals that cannot economically be kept through winter are killed and preserved. Salting intensifies. Smokehouses work. Barrels fill.
The household prepares not for a menu, but for survival across months. By November, darkness returns early. Candles become more important. So does accounting. Every preserved fish and barrel of ale represents planning done weeks before. Then Advent begins its own pattern of restraint and preparation, leading toward Christmas again. The year closes where it began, feast surrounded by winter. For Henry VII, Christmas was particularly useful political theatre. A king who had seized the throne through victory could present his household as stable, ancient, generous, and divinely ordered. The ceremonial traditions of monarchy made the Tudor dynasty look older than it was. Minstrels, heralds, religious services, gifts, games, and food transformed a politically young regime into something that felt inherited. Arthur and Henry grew up inside this annual repetition. Childhood memories accumulate through cycles. The smell of spice becomes Christmas. Fish becomes Friday. Venison becomes hunt. Sweet wine becomes ceremony. Broth becomes illness. Fine white bread becomes rank. A particular cup becomes father. A particular hall becomes mother. Then people disappear, and the same smells remain. That is how food stores grief. After Arthur's death in 1502, the next Easter came anyway. After Elizabeth of York died in February 1503, kitchens still prepared Lent. The household calendar had no category for a dynasty that wanted time to stop. Henry VII appears to have been deeply affected by Elizabeth's death. Their marriage had begun as politics, but developed into a partnership that contemporaries and later historians often treat as genuinely close. She had helped give the Tudor regime Yorkist legitimacy and a family image. Without her, the court's domestic centre changed. A queen also mediated hospitality. Her ladies, chambers, entertainments and patronage created a social world parallel to the king's. Removing that world did not merely empty a chair, it altered networks of service and intimacy. For the surviving Prince Henry, his mother's death came at 11 years old. The boy, who would later marry 6 times, lost the woman who had embodied queenship in his childhood. Catherine of Aragon, his brother's widow, remained in England under uncertain circumstances. Marriage negotiations involving the prince became matters of diplomacy. His own future was discussed in councils before he could control it. His diet was one of the smaller things other people controlled for him, but small controls are often the ones a child feels most directly. You cannot understand a treaty at 11. You can understand that you do not want the fish. This is where a responsible documentary can use imagination without pretending to possess a lost diary. We can say what the room might have felt like. We can say what foods were normal. We can say what rules surrounded eating. We can say that royal children, like all children, had preferences. We cannot say, as a documented quotation, Henry refused his father's meal because it was disgusting. The line is cinematic, not archival. The real evidence gives us better scenes. Lambert Simnel washing dishes beneath the king who defeated him. Arthur dining as heir before dying at 15. Catherine of Aragon entering a foreign court where every bite could be watched. Elizabeth of York's household continuing through repeated pregnancies. The surviving Prince Henry becoming more valuable each time another family member died. Henry VII rebuilding a burned palace and naming it Richmond. The king spending his final illness in the same palace that proclaimed Tudor permanence. These are not invented, and around all of them, food continues. Consider one more object, the pie. To modern diners, a pie is comfort food. In a Tudor household, pastry had practical power. A sturdy crust could hold fillings, protect them during cooking, help transport them, and create impressive forms for presentation. Not every crust was necessarily intended to be eaten in full. Some functioned more like containers. Fillings could include meat, game, fish, fruit, spices, fat, eggs, or combinations that modern categories separate. The pastry department was therefore both kitchen and packaging workshop. A venison pie could travel as a gift more safely than a bare roast. A raised crust could display heraldic decoration. Small pies could be portioned. Large ones could dominate a table. The crust also concealed. Before cutting, the diner could not fully see the filling. That made pies natural objects of suspicion in stories about poisoning, even when actual danger was mundane spoilage. A sealed food carries mystery. The same is true of pottage. This broad category ranged from simple peasant stews to sophisticated elite dishes. Ingredients could be boiled together, thickened with bread, enriched with meat broth, coloured with saffron, sweetened, or sharpened with vinegar. Texture could range from soup to something nearly solid. Pottage made efficient use of ingredients and could be scaled to feed many people. It is one reason medieval food resists modern menu categories. The meal was not organised around a single plated protein, surrounded by separate vegetables. Foods mixed. Sauces carried bread. Meat entered liquid. Fruit entered meat. Sugar entered savoury dishes. A modern prince transported backward might struggle. A Tudor prince transported forward would probably find our food equally strange. Raw lettuce in winter, tomatoes in everything, potatoes fried in oil, cold milk from a refrigerator, chocolate bars cheaper than spices, ice in drinks, coffee in paper cups, chicken eaten with the fingers by everyone, regardless of rank, food crossing oceans in hours, strawberries in December, microwaves heating a plate in 90 seconds. The shock would run both ways. That thought is useful because it removes the smugness from historical judgment. Henry VII's cooks were not bad cooks because they lacked refrigeration. They were highly skilled workers solving difficult problems with available technology. To roast for hundreds using open fire requires judgment modern home cooks rarely develop. To organise simultaneous dishes without electric timers is an achievement. To preserve food through winter without industrial refrigeration requires knowledge accumulated over generations. The brutality lay in the conditions. Heat, smoke, long hours, hierarchy, injury. lack of medical care, seasonal pressure, the constant possibility that a mistake affecting a royal stomach could become a career-ending event. A cook's success disappeared into the meal. His failure could become history. Kitchen injury was common in an age of blades, boiling liquids, heavy cauldrons, open flames, slippery floors, and no modern protective equipment. Burns were occupational facts. Cuts risked infection. Smoke damaged lungs and eyes. Lifting heavy pots strained backs. Young workers performed repetitive tasks. Turnspits stood close to heat for long periods. Scullions immersed hands in filthy water. Lambert Simnel's demotion becomes even sharper when we picture the physical labour rather than merely naming the job. He had been taught to sit like a king. Now he worked where servants sweated to feed one. Henry's clemency was clever because it did not spare Simnel from humiliation. It converted his body into a lesson visible to the household. A pretender who could have become a martyr instead became part of the machinery of Tudor monarchy. And perhaps the strangest part is that Simnel survived. He appears to have remained in royal service and later became a falconer, a more respectable position. He lived into Henry VIII's reign. The boy, once crowned against Henry VII, outlived the king who defeated him. Somewhere in those later years, he may have watched the former Prince Henry eat as king. That image joins the generations. The kitchen remembers what the throne tries to forget. Food also connects Henry VII to the wider transformation of England. During his reign, John Cabot sailed from Bristol under royal authorisation and reached land across the North Atlantic in 1497. English involvement in Atlantic exploration was still small compared with what would come later, but the geography of European appetite was beginning to change. New plants, animals, commodities and empires would eventually transform English food beyond recognition. Henry VII died before potatoes, tomatoes, chocolate, tea, coffee, and many later staples reshaped the British table. His palate belonged to the old world even as the new one entered English political imagination. The spices on his table came through long-established Eurasian trade routes. The sugar he valued belonged to an expanding system of Mediterranean and Atlantic production that would later become entangled with plantation slavery on a massive scale. The wine in his cellar connected England to continental vineyards. The fish on fast days connected religion to maritime commerce. The venison connected royal privilege to enclosed land. A plate is a map if you know how to read it. Henry VII's plate maps a kingdom emerging from civil war and looking outward. His son's plates map a dynasty that has not yet decided what it will become. Arthur's line ends before it begins. Henry's line will convulse England. And all of that future sits invisibly beside the bread. By the final years of Henry VII's reign, that future had narrowed to one young man. The king's health was deteriorating. He withdrew more often into private chambers. The court continued around him, but the distance between sovereign and household grew. Illness changes the meaning of food faster than almost anything else. A healthy ruler can choose among dishes. A sick ruler negotiates with appetite, pain, breath, nausea, weakness and medical advice. If Henry's final illness was indeed a pulmonary disease, as many historians believe, then eating itself may at times have become tiring. Fever suppresses appetite. Coughing interrupts swallowing. Weakness turns a formal meal into labour. Rich sauces lose their charm. Wine can feel harsh. Meat becomes work. Broth becomes attractive not because it is royal, but because it is possible. The palace kitchen does not know how to cure him. It only knows how to prepare what the physicians request. This is perhaps the final humiliation of royal food. For decades, Henry had used abundance to project control. He could command deer from parks, wine from abroad, fine bread, fish, spices, and sugar. He could regulate who ate what in his household. He could punish fraud. He could rebuild palaces. He could turn a pretender into a kitchen servant. But he could not order himself hungry. He could not command his lungs to heal. He could not eat his way out of mortality. On April 21st, 1509, Henry VII died at Richmond Palace. He was 52.
The household that had served him immediately entered one of monarchy's strangest transitions. A dead king is still surrounded by the objects of kingship for a few hours, but the power has already moved elsewhere. Plate, rooms, guards, clothes, servants, horses, and kitchens remain. The body at the centre no longer needs dinner. Officials delayed public announcement of his death while arrangements were made. His 17-year-old son became Henry VIII. For years, the surviving prince had been protected because the dynasty depended on him. Now the protection became authority. The boy who had eaten under other people's rules could begin writing rules for everyone else. The contrast must have felt enormous. Henry VIII's early reign projected energy. He was young, athletic, educated, musical, and eager to display magnificence. He hunted, jousted, danced, entertained, and spent with a freedom that stood in sharp contrast to the financial severity associated with his father's later years. The hated fiscal ministers Empson and Dudley were arrested and eventually executed, helping the new king distance himself from unpopular features of the old regime. The table changed tone, even if many of the servants, offices, recipes, and habits remained. This is how institutions survive rulers. The new king can prefer different dishes, invite different companions, and spend more aggressively, but he inherits stores, offices, accounting methods, serving customs, cooks, suppliers, and expectations. Henry VIII's later famous food world did not appear from nowhere on the morning after Henry VII died. It grew from the system his father had maintained and from even older medieval traditions. That continuity is why Henry VII deserves a place in the story of Tudor food. He stands in the shadow of a son whose appetite became legend. Yet the first Tudor king built the political stability that allowed the second to stage such extravagant monarchy. Without Henry VII's survival, there is no Henry VIII as we know him. Without the food machine of the first Tudor court, there is no later Hampton Court spectacle. And without the pressure placed on royal children to survive, there is no reason to understand why the future Henry VIII's meals mattered before anyone cared what he liked. The phrase, "even his sons refuse to eat it," can therefore survive only if we understand what it really means. Not a documented scene of Arthur and Henry throwing plates across a hall, not evidence that Henry VII employed uniquely incompetent cooks, not proof that royal meat was routinely rotten. The deeper meaning is that even princes could reach the limit of what ceremony could force the body to desire. A child can be surrounded by the best food available and still turn his face away. A sick heir can reject a broth prepared by 10 servants. A fasting prince can long for forbidden meat. A homesick princess can miss the food of Spain while sitting beneath English gold. A king can lose his appetite in a palace full of provisions. Taste remains stubbornly personal inside a system designed to make everything political. That tension is what makes the Tudor table feel so modern despite its strange recipes. We still use food to express status. We still photograph expensive meals. We still judge institutions by hospitality. We still negotiate children's appetites. We still turn dietary choices into morality. We still worry about contamination. We still trust invisible supply chains. We still waste food while others go hungry. We still disguise labour behind polished service. What changed is scale, technology, and choice. A modern diner in London can open a phone and order food from almost any major culinary tradition on Earth. A supermarket offers summer fruit in winter. Refrigeration slows decay. Temperature probes tell us whether meat is cooked safely. Packaging lists ingredients. Public health systems investigate outbreaks. Water arrives through treated municipal networks. A home cook can freeze leftovers for weeks. A child can reject dinner and eat cereal later. To Henry VII, this would look like sorcery. Yet we have lost things as well. Most modern diners have no idea which field produced their wheat, which animal became their beef, who caught their fish, or which hands loaded the delivery truck. Tudor food was less safe, but often more visibly connected to place, season, and labour. A venison gift had a known giver. A loaf belonged to a specific bakehouse. A fish reflected Friday. A harvest changed the menu. Modern abundance hides origins. Tudor abundance advertised them. This does not make the past better. It makes it legible in a different way. Walk today through Richmond and almost all of Henry VII's palace has vanished. Fragments survive. Portions incorporated into later buildings, a gateway, sections of wall, archaeological traces, the shape of streets, the river that once carried goods to the royal landing. People pass them on ordinary errands. Few hear the kitchens. But stand near the Thames and imagine the traffic 5 centuries ago. A boat noses toward the bank loaded with barrels. A servant shouts for men to unload them. A cart rattles across the yard. A clerk complains that the count is wrong. A butcher carries meat toward a service range. Someone drops a basket. A dog lunges for a scrap. Smoke moves over the roofs. In a chamber above, a prince is being taught Latin. In another, the Queen's attendants fold linen. In a kitchen, perhaps, Lambert Simnel scrubs the possessions of a king he once pretended to be. And somewhere deeper in the palace, Henry VII studies a realm he still does not fully trust. This is the court behind the banquet painting. Not silence, not endless golden platters, a living, sweating, bargaining, cooking, carrying, counting organism. Food moves through it like blood. The comparison is almost literal. Stop the food, and the court stops. Soldiers can march only if fed. Horses can travel only if fed. Clerks can work only if fed. Ambassadors expect to be fed. Musicians, guards, laundresses, priests, pages, nobles, cooks, children, and kings all depend on a supply chain stretching beyond the palace walls. That dependence makes royal power look less absolute. Henry VII can order a man arrested, but he cannot make wheat grow during a failed harvest. He can command a feast, but someone must still catch the fish. He can demand fresh venison, but a deer must be found and killed. He can order fine bread, but flour must remain dry. He can demand hot food, but a servant must carry it before it cools. Monarchy is powerful because thousands of ordinary actions succeed at the same time. Every meal is a referendum on logistics, and every uneaten plate is evidence that logistics cannot rule desire. This is where the sons return to the story. Arthur was raised to be the first Tudor king born to the dynasty. His education, marriage, household, and food were arranged with that future in mind. He never reached it. He died at 15, and no feast could restore him. Edmund, another son, died in early childhood. Royal privilege could not preserve him either. Henry survived. That survival changed Europe. He inherited not only his father's crown, but his father's anxiety about succession. Later, as Henry VIII, his desperate search for a legitimate male heir would reshape religion and politics across England. Marriages would be broken, a queen would be cast aside, another would be executed, monasteries would fall, the royal supremacy would be asserted, all because dynastic continuity remained an obsession. The child whose meals had been supervised became a king who would reorganize a kingdom in pursuit of a son. Seen from that perspective, the dinner table of his youth is not trivial at all. It is where the dynasty's central fear sat quietly every day. Will the heir live? Enough meat could not answer that. Enough sugar could not answer that. Enough physicians could not answer that. Enough prayer did not always answer that. The royal kitchen could nourish a body. It could not guarantee a future. This is also why food at court was simultaneously luxurious and anxious. We tend to associate luxury with relaxation. For the Tudors, luxury often increased scrutiny. The more valuable the diner, the more carefully he was watched. The more important the feast, the more rules surrounded it. The more expensive the dish, the more people were responsible for it. A peasant might eat a rough meal in peace. A prince could eat a magnificent one under surveillance. Which is the better dinner? There is no single answer. The poor man faces hunger, insecurity, hard labour, and far greater risk of malnutrition. We should not romanticize poverty as freedom, but the prince's privilege comes with obligations that reach into his mouth. He represents the future of the state even while chewing. That is the dark exchange of monarchy. You receive the best available food. You lose the right to be ordinary about it. And Henry VII's own life demonstrates the bargain. Before Bosworth, he was an exile with uncertain prospects. After Bosworth, everything he consumed could be interpreted as royal. His household had to prove the victory every day.
A weak court suggested a weak king. A disorderly hall suggested disorder in the realm. A badly managed kitchen hinted at badly managed government. No wonder he counted. No wonder officers worried about waste. No wonder rank determined portions. No wonder the table became ritual. The Tudors did not separate private life from public meaning as cleanly as modern people often do. The king's marriage was diplomacy. His children were succession. His clothing was propaganda. His chapel was legitimacy. His meals were government. Even digestion had politics. Foreign observers commented on rulers' appearance because health implied stability. A king who looked thin, weak, pale, swollen, or ill could generate rumour. Appetite could become diplomatic intelligence. If a ruler stopped appearing at dinner, ambassadors noticed. If a prince seemed sickly, marriage negotiations could change. A royal body was public information hidden inside private chambers.
The modern celebrity press has ancient ancestors. Courts whispered, servants saw things, ambassadors asked questions, physicians knew secrets, cooks knew whether plates returned full. A kitchen can become an archive that never writes itself down. Imagine how much history disappeared because the people who saw it were illiterate, too low-ranking to record it, or simply uninterested in preserving it. A scullion may have known which dish the young Henry always left untouched. A nurse may have known what Arthur demanded when sick. A cook may have cursed a physician's instructions. A laundress may have seen vomit on linen after a feast. None of them needed to write it for us. The silence of the archive is not proof that nothing happened. It is a reminder of who had paper. That silence gives sensational history a temptation. Fill the gap with certainty. Say the sons refused the food. Say the meals were disgusting. Say the meat was rotten. Say the palace stank beyond endurance. These claims are easy to visualize and easy to repeat. But real history is stronger when it admits where the flaw disappears. We know enough without pretending. We know Henry VII's court existed inside a late medieval food system built on rank, religion, preservation, seasonality, humoral medicine, and labour. We know elite food could be astonishingly varied and expensive. We know much of it would feel unfamiliar to a modern palate. We know royal children had controlled households and were treated as dynastic assets. We know Arthur died young and Henry became sole surviving male heir. We know the royal household used kitchens as part of political hierarchy so literally that Lambert Simnel, a defeated child pretender, was put to work there. We know the king rebuilt Sheen as Richmond Palace and died there in 1509. We know later Tudor kitchen systems preserved and expanded many of the same institutional principles. From those facts, a vivid world emerges without a single invented tantrum. And that world is darker than the easy version, because no villain is needed. The food did not have to be poisoned. The cooks did not have to be incompetent. Henry VII did not have to be a cruel father forcing rotten meat on his sons. The system itself was enough. It took living creatures from fields and forests, transformed them through smoke and labour, ranked them according to status, moved them through guarded corridors, wrapped them in ceremony, interpreted them through religion and medicine, and placed them before children whose lives belonged to politics. Sometimes those children ate. Sometimes, almost certainly, they did not. The plate was removed either way. Another dish arrived. The court continued. That may be the most Tudor image of all. Not Henry VIII tearing into a giant turkey leg, a bird that did not even belong to the ordinary English table of his father's reign, and an image popular culture has abused for decades. Not a mountain of rotten meat covered in spices, not princes dramatically starving themselves in protest. Instead, picture a servant lifting away a silver or pewter dish with expensive food still on it, while a boy sits beneath the weight of a future crown. The servant does not ask why.
he carries it back. Down the passage, the temperature drops. Another servant waits. In the kitchen, someone is already preparing the next course. Outside, the Thames keeps moving. 500 years later, we stand in a world where royal kitchens have become museums, palaces have become ruins, and foods once reserved for kings can be bought cheaply under fluorescent light. Pepper sits on every table. Sugar costs almost nothing. Oranges cross continents. Ice is expected. Clean water comes from a tap. Meat can be refrigerated for days. A digital thermometer can tell a home cook more about safety than the most learned Tudor physician knew. Yet the old court still speaks through our habits. We still seat important people first. We still use banquets to honour power. We still serve special foods at religious festivals. We still bring cake to mark succession from one year of life to the next. We still associate rare ingredients with status. We still judge hosts by generosity. We still watch what famous people eat. We still argue over whether children should clean their plates. The distance between us and Henry VII is enormous, but it is crossed every time food becomes more than hunger. That is what remains of his court today. Not the taste of one lost sauce, not proof of one prince's refusal. The enduring thing is the realization that a meal can contain an entire society. At Henry VII's table, you can see the aftermath of civil war, the invention of Tudor legitimacy, the anxiety of succession, the reach of the church, the limitations of medieval medicine, the growth of royal finance, the labour of servants, the power of international trade, the vulnerability of children, and the stubborn humanity of appetite. The feast looks rich because it is supposed to. Look closer and you see fear. The silver shines because someone polished it. The bread is white because someone sifted it. The venison is fresh because someone hunted it. The fish is on the table because the calendar demanded it. The spice came from thousands of miles away because wealth needed to be visible. The prince sits still because he has been trained to. The king watches because too much depends on the boy living. And if the boy turns his face away, even for a moment, all that power reaches its limit. A crown can command a kingdom. It cannot command hunger. That is the brutal reality behind the food of Henry VII's court. The meals were not simply bad. They were something more complicated and more revealing. Expensive, laborious, repetitive, symbolic, seasonal, medically controlled, religiously regulated, sometimes spectacular, sometimes cold, sometimes overcooked, sometimes heavily salted, sometimes delicious, sometimes unwanted, and always political. Even a prince could have everything on the table and still not have what he wanted. And perhaps that is why this vanished world remains so unsettling. We like to imagine that wealth creates freedom. Henry VII's court suggests the opposite can also be true. The higher you climbed, the more people watched. The more important your body became, the less completely it belonged to you. The richer the feast, the more meanings crowded onto the plate. Arthur never became king. Henry did. Their father built a dynasty by controlling almost everything he could, with the table preserved the one fact no monarch ever conquered. Human beings remain human, even under cloth of gold. They grow hungry. They lose appetite. They become sick. They remember home. They dislike certain tastes. They grieve. They age. They die. The kitchens keep working until they do not. The fire burns down. The dishes are cleared. The hall empties. The river moves past the palace walls. And centuries later, when almost everything else has vanished, the question still feels strangely intimate. What did they eat? The answer is not only meat, fish, bread, ale, wine, spices, sugar, pottage, pies, fruit, and almond milk. They ate hierarchy. They ate religion. They ate medicine. They ate fear.
They ate the fragile promise that the Tudor dynasty would survive one more meal.